celebrated. And obviously, I'm inspired by our whole theme for Power in the Spirit this season, which is Candlemas, the purification of the Virgin Mary / presentation of Christ in the temple. Wonderful subject. And I can't say how much I appreciated Dave Delaney's really thoughtful theological interpretation of it last night. I intend to offer nothing whatsoever along those lines. I'm just going to run you past a bunch of dates, but maybe comment a little bit. And big plus, I've got art. So does everyone get the basic idea? If you don't, unmute yourself and ask for clarification.
I just got here. I don't know what you said.
Oh, what I said is we're going to be looking at the little back corners of the church calendar. The stuff that you probably know about, but don't spend a lot of time thinking about, like the Feast of the Presentation.
Okay.
So if it's okay with everybody, and honestly, because I've got the control button, even if it's not okay, I'm going to share my screen, which is just it's not even a fancy PowerPoint or anything. It is just a Microsoft Word document, but it'll let you sort of see what I'm looking at. Everybody see it? Shake your head vigorously if you're not. Okay. I can see most of you, but not all of you. So this is the basics. Hang on a sec. Let's go into focus view because it looks really cool. First thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about the church's calendar. Almost all of you know, and probably all of you know, the church has its own calendar, which is separate from the calendar with the 12 months and flip pages that is sitting next to everybody's refrigerator at home. We measure time just a little bit differently than the world does. And most of us have been taught to think of it either as a list, like this one from Augsburg Fortress, that my congregation, my altar guild, absolutely must have that in the sacristy at all times, or else they become terribly confused and melt down. I'm not really sure why, but they've told me this a dozen times, so we always have some around. Or more creatively, and I think more helpfully, instead of thinking of it as a list, you've been taught to think of it as a cycle. And the cycle has the sort of what's sometimes called the festival season, and then what's called sometimes, just ordinary time, or the story of Jesus, and the story of the people of God. And all of these names are made up, and you don't have to worry too much about the names. And this is just one of several different ways of representing this stuff to give an idea. And our calendar starts with Advent, moves through Christmas, the Sundays after Epiphany, the season of Lent, Easter, Holy Week, Lenten, Holy Week, Easter, very little time around Pentecost, and then a long green summer, unless we happen to be celebrating something else. This is the big outline, and it's about right, and it's as much as most people need to know. It helps to think in a little more detail, though, to know that the calendar is really governed by two different ways of thinking about time. One is called the temporal cycle, that is the cycle of time, and the other is the sanctoral cycle, or this, really it comes from the word saint, or holiness. But basically, when we talk about these, the temporal cycle is all the Sundays of the year in order, along with the principal festivals, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the seasons of Advent and Lent, which are sometimes labeled as other observances, liturgical weekdays, which all match up to the Sundays. And most of these, with a few exceptions, the main ones being Christmas and Epiphany, are all movable. That is, they're governed, their date on the sort of worldly calendar is governed by the date of Easter, which is another whole subject for another night. Those of you who've had to read articles on the subject chuckle. It's a long and fiercely combative thing. And in fact, a little piece of fun information. By the late Middle Ages, some churches were being built as the most high-tech solar observatories in the world at the time, because people wanted to be really, really super precise about dating Easter, because a whole chunk of the church's calendar depends on it. The other cycle, though, is the sanctoral cycle, and most of these are fixed dates. They occur on the same calendar date each year. And this includes what our church calendar calls commemorations, which are mostly, although not all, the day that somebody died, a saint's day. We almost always remember saints on the day they died. Ancient custom. And then there are lesser festivals, things like Reformation Day, or oddly enough, the Annunciation. These are generally things where I don't want to say Jesus is marginal to them, but it's easy to say that other people get a little more emphasis when you're telling the story. Anyway, and they all fall on a fixed date. Both of these are going on. You should know about them. It's a kind of an important dynamic, and that's pretty much all I'm going to say about it. Everybody with me so far? I told you the first few minutes were really dull, right? Okay. So before the Reformation, I'm sure you've all heard the story about how before the Reformation, the church calendar was cluttered with saints' days and all sorts of small observances. And if everybody followed everyone, everybody got a day off every day, which obviously can't be true. But in fact, the medieval calendar was a really complex thing. There was, in fact, an observance for every day of the year, and often several observances. People didn't always observe them. The average person in the street certainly didn't. Maybe if you were in a monastery or a priest saying his daily private mass or something like that. But for the most part, regionally, some saints' days were more important than other saints' days. The saint who had lived in your town or in a town nearby, or whose shrine you lived near, something like that. And of course, it is absolutely true. All the stuff you've heard about the crazy superstition that had become attached to a lot of these. There was a particularly famous book called The Golden Legend. I've got a copy. It's great reading, especially the part about how after St. Thomas Becket is killed in his cathedral, a bird swoops down and drinks a little bit of the martyr's blood and instantly can talk and goes and spreads his story throughout England. Clearly, the best you can say is that it was pious nonsense. And I'm not going to say everybody believed it, but I'm going to say people loved the stories. During the Reformation, we, for reasons that I think are probably obvious to you, reevaluated a lot of those stories. And in fact, a lot of the observances. The whole sanctoral cycle got trimmed down dramatically. Not just by Lutherans, in fact, not even mostly by Lutherans, but by the emerging churches of the Reformation. So that, when you look at the sanctoral cycle in the Reformed churches, the Calvinist churches, there basically is none. It's very, very limited. Lutherans took a pretty typical approach for the Lutheran style of reform. And I think, again, this will sound familiar. Generally speaking, if a thing wasn't broken, we didn't try to fix it. If it was broken, we fixed it. And only under the worst possible circumstances did we decide it was so broken we had to throw it out. And there were some of those. If a thing was genuinely just, you couldn't do it without lapsing into superstition or worse yet, Pelagianism, we chucked it. So, for instance, when talking about the saints, there's really a short reference to them in the Augsburg Confession. It says that the saints are to be remembered so that we may strengthen our faith when we see how they experienced grace, and so that each person, according to their calling, should take the saints' good works as an example. So they're there to strengthen our faith, to give us hope, and to be an example for us. What they're not there for, what the reformers didn't bother to mention because it seemed so obvious to them, was they're not there to be prayed to. They're not there to intercede for us. Jesus does that just fine. We're really covered in that department. But that doesn't mean we forget about them. That doesn't mean we stop remembering them. And what's true of the sanctuary cycle is even more true of what I'm including under it as some of the lesser festivals, some of the other things, as you'll see. Since the Reformation, there's been a strong tendency among Protestants of all stripes to undervalue the sanctoral cycle and reduce the number of lesser festivals and commemorations. This was really strong under Calvinist influence in the 18th and early 19th centuries. By the 20th century, Lutherans and Anglicans both were, for a lot of reasons, sort of recovering their Reformation heritage. And that included recovering some of the beauties of the sanctoral cycle. That that we have stories to tell as a community of faith that supplement the stories that are told in the temporal cycle, that supplement the stories told in the Sundays and seasons. And that's kind of what we're talking about tonight, is some of that extra stuff. Is it essential to the practice of the Christian faith? No. Then again, is anything in the church calendar essential to the practice of the Christian faith? You could make an argument that the answer there is no, too. Does it sometimes help? Does it add depth and texture and understanding to who we are as a people and how we've lived out the gospel as a people all through history? I think it can. That's my basic perspective. So, a couple of things. I just wanted to start with these because these are really obscure, and I've spent much of my life periodically trying to remember which was which. So there were two observances that were more or less dropped at the Reformation. One is called Ember Days. These are periods of fasting and abstinence that occurred 4 times a year. You could sort of remember them by when they came. Even Roman Catholicism dropped them after Vatican II. Oddly enough, Anglicans still use them for ordinations. And some German Lutherans during the Reformation and later set them aside as a time for catechetical instruction. That is, for teaching people the basics of the faith, going back to the elements of the catechism, the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments and the Creed, and the basic teachings about the sacraments. I've always thought that this might be a usable idea for us to have catechetical festivals 4 times a year, every year on a regular basis, and to be able to say, you know what, this is going to be our fall retreat, our fall Ember Days retreat here in the church for anybody who wants to come. And this season we're gonna look hard at the Lord's Prayer. It's a thing a church could do. There's certainly no obligation to do it, and there's no real reason to connect it to the Ember Days. By the way, the word ember here has nothing to do with the embers in a fire. It's a long, complicated etymological thing that takes you back to, I think it's medieval High Norse or something. So much of this does. Another one that I actually am a lot more enthusiastic about, especially for people in small town or country churches, are Rogation Days. This is a couple of days that occur twice a year. One's more important than the other, used for prayer and abstinence. They were both originally related to the harvest. But eventually, what they got to be was an occasion when the members of the church would get together and have a parade around the edges of their village. And the village and the farms were more or less together, coextensive with the parish. That is where the worshiping community lived. And they'd walk around them, and they would even take sticks and sort of, smack down new growth to mark a border. It was called beating the bounds. And it was, it was a religious thing. You could sing hymns, but it was also a social thing. Sometimes they would, sometimes your parish pastor would do it with you, but sometimes you'd also elect a boy bishop, which was a big deal in the Middle Ages. They were always finding some holiday where they could take some kid and stick a mitre on him and pretend he was the bishop for an afternoon. There are a number of these, and this is one. And they would walk the boy bishop around the bounds of the parish, and it all sounds sort of pointless until you realize that your village, your parish, was your basic social unit, and it was also your basic worship unit. That was your church. As for a lot of people, it still is their church. And what they were doing was asserting the boundaries, saying that anyone who lives here is part of our community. Anyone who lives here is our people. And that wasn't exclusive of other people. It was saying, it was a way of building connection and community. There's a wonderful, wonderful book called Stripping of the Altars by a writer named Eamon Duffy. And it's a very long, dense read about specifically about English Christianity in the years before the Reformation. I don't recommend the whole book to all of you, but the first couple of chapters talk about how rituals like this formed and shaped a kind of a coherent, consistent community. And it's worth a read because it can really reshape your thinking about pre-Reformation Christianity. Anyway, Anglicans still kind of love the beating of the bounds. The color picture I've got for you here is actually from North Carolina. That's some church in one of the cities in North Carolina doing this. And the black and white picture is there's a church in Germany that's been doing this, that does this every 7 years and has been for centuries. They have a big beating of the bounds. It's just kind of cool. And I think it's something that if I were pastoring in the right community, a community that was defined enough geographically, which I am certainly not right now, I might be able to use. Anybody have any questions about this craziness? Okay. Okay. I'm having a weird situation. My mouse just died, so I can't go to the next page. Hang on.
Michael,
Yes.
Scott here. Was this basically connected with the feudal system, with the little villages and?
The villages, no, not really. I mean, it isn't.
Okay.
It isn't inherently feudal because it continued way after that.
Okay.
It was connected though to the idea of village life and a parish as, and this is a problem in the United States because we really lack this. The idea of a parish being coextensive with a worshiping community, being
Okay.
both a geographical and a sort of a census body. You see what I mean?
Okay. Thank you very much.
But it's not about who you owed fealty to. It wasn't connected. It was not connected, as a lot of medieval church rituals were, to paying your taxes, either to the church or to the government. That's just like a whole category of things. We could talk about Shrove Tuesday in those terms, and the whole confessing before Easter, because that was also when you paid your tithe, and they were indeed connected. And that was all connected to whether or not you were a member of the worshiping community.
That's where I want to be. I'm on the Virginia Synod Sermon Series homepage or whatever it is.
So, okay. First thing we have to talk about when we talk about how Lutherans have adapted the medieval cycle of observances is the Virgin Mary, because, well, I mean, she was, as you well know, from the 12th century onward, from about the 1100s, she went from being a very important saint to being the saint who dominated the calendar, and for hundreds and hundreds of years dominated.
Okay, what about?
Somebody might want to mute. Karen, could you mute yourself, please? if you don't mind. Oops, lost her. Lost Mary, that is, not Karen. So
Go back to the
Sorry.
email. Now I can do that.
she had been an important saint all through history. At the Council of Ephesus, she was given the title of the Mother of God, or the Bearer of God, the Theotokos. But from the 12th century on, her cult, you could call it, in a well-intentioned way, attention paid to Mary grew to where it really did dominate the church calendar and certainly dominated popular piety. And that was something that the various Protestant movements had to give a great deal of thought to, because there was, and I think it's fair to say that in some little corners of Roman Catholicism, there still is a legitimate temptation to let devotion to Mary edge out devotion to Jesus, or at least become equal to it. And that's an obvious, I don't have to tell you, it's an obvious theological problem. But that doesn't mean, again, the Lutherans, if a thing wasn't broke, they wouldn't fix it. And if it was broke, they'd try to fix it before they tossed it out. And that was also true of devotion to Mary. So Luther was fine with calling her the Mother of God, which was just the Latin rendering of the God bearer, the Theotokos. Curiously, and this is something I didn't know till I was, fairly well along in my theological studies, he and other Lutherans of his generation took for granted her perpetual virginity, which is the really strange medieval idea that she somehow gave birth to Jesus and yet remained in some meaningful way, and nobody's ever really entirely united on what that way was, a virgin forever. So if you dig into it deeply, it becomes, the further you dig into it, the more complicated that idea gets. What's funny is that Luther had no trouble with it, even though to us it seems strangely illogical. Elizabeth Grant says, didn't Mary have other kids? Yes. Some people argue that she did. Others argue that she don't. That argument has been alive all through Christian history. It has been alive within Lutheranism. It has also been able to coexist with the idea of perpetual virginity. Go figure, right? That's really strange. And it really begs the question of what they mean by virginity, which becomes an anthropological question to which there are some complex answers. And we could go down that rabbit hole all night if you'd like. But here's the thing, it's actually in the Book of Concord. The Lutheran Confessions, in at least two places, affirm Mary's perpetual virginity. Luther does it in the Smalcald Articles, and then it comes up again in the next generation after Luther in the Formula of Concord. Kind of weird. We make nothing of it in the 21st century. It rarely ever comes up, and I think most of us are fine with that. The other thing is the Hail Mary. It was changed at the Council of Trent. They added that later section about Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and in the hour of our death. Luther did not use that, nor would he have, since that clearly was asking Mary to intercede for sinners when, again, Jesus is more than capable, thank you very much. But he apparently had no real trouble at all with the Hail Mary in its original form, which, needless to say, is pretty strictly biblical. So what did that mean in terms of the festivals? Luther proposed that for the sake of continuity and good order, and because people loved them, people might hold on to 4 of the so-called Marian feasts. Her birthday, September 8th, they thought. How did people figure that out? Well, I'll give you a hint. It wasn't because anyone knew her birthday, right? Never with these dates assume that it's because that was the actual day it happened, any more than with Christmas, right? We all know the history there is a little complex and fuzzy. The purification, which is what we're here to talk about, Candlemas, the Annunciation on March 25th, and the Assumption on August 15th. We've pretty much dropped the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin. We, with rare exceptions, our modern church calendar doesn't recognize the day of anybody's birth, except oddly Martin Luther King Jr. He's the one person that I know of that we remember on the day that he was born instead of the day that he was reborn into eternal life. So in the ELW, as Dave was saying last night, the presentation of our Lord in the temple, February 2nd, is not identified as the purification of the Blessed Virgin, but it does, historically, it is the same day, and Candlemas has always been observed as remembering the same event. You could just interpret it either way. You can interpret it as connected to Mary or connected to Jesus. It's all one story. Dave, I can see your face. Shake your head if you disagree violently with me. Tell me if I'm just going down the road. Okay, he gave me a thumbs up. I can keep going. Whew. Now, here's the thing, and I don't know if you're going to get into this the next time you talk, Dave, but the idea of the purification has come and gone, not the purification of Mary, but the purification or churching of women after childbirth has come and gone in popularity over the centuries. Basically, you've seen the passage in Deuteronomy about offering a sacrifice after childbirth. And there's a rule there. In Christianity, this got sort of reshaped in a couple of different ways, and eventually turned into a ritual by which, after childbirth, a woman would come to church for the first time since she'd given birth. And you remember, giving birth in pre-modern times was an absolutely terrifying and heroic activity, right? It was the female equivalent of going to war. Death in childbirth was extremely common. Death, shortly after childbirth was extremely common. Death of babies was extremely common. The whole thing was fraught with emotion and physical risk. So that when you come to church, you're homesick for a little while, not sick, you're home recovering and possibly sick. I mean, infections, real thing. When you come to church, it's a big deal, right? We often tend to dismiss it because the business about purification is very Old Testament and then very medieval in a way that we moderns find misleading. It does not reflect, that language does not reflect our way of thinking about childbirth. And I'm not sure it even reflects what was really going on socially when women came back to church. Because if you look at the prayers, there was a little purification, but mostly it was, the prayers are mostly welcome back. Remained a big deal in Anglican circles. It was included in the Book of Common Prayer and all its subsequent editions, and has been. Lutherans have not made much use of it in modern history. I've always wondered if it didn't have some pastoral application that we shouldn't reconsider. Childbirth isn't quite as dangerous and quite as traumatic as it once was. On the other hand, we're living in an era when a huge number of births are become medical emergencies, or at least become that in the eyes of the doctors, and are treated that way. It's certainly an enormous, sort of passage from one stage of life to another, especially a first childbirth. The idea of welcoming a woman, and possibly a child's father as well, but this has always been a ritual for women, welcoming them back into church as a way of the community embracing them and saying, we're so glad to see you again, might have some real traction in some congregations. And of course, treating the presentation that way, the presentation or the purification of Mary, becomes a way to talk about that every year and to introduce it if a particular congregation wanted to explore that.
Michael?
Yes.
I also have heard that it has been used with stillbirths, with moms who have lost the child.
Yeah. I would certainly consider using it that way. I think one of the great, just while I'm yammering on about birth and rites of passage, one of the things that the church is sorely lacking, in my opinion, is a long established ritual for recognizing the trauma of losing a child in birth or of a stillbirth. It didn't, and I think it's probably because they were so common in the Middle Ages. It's less common now, and I think that may up the trauma. I'm not sure. I do know that my wife worked for a couple of years with a hospital chaplain up in New York State who had done a lot of that. I mean, she worked with a lot of women who had stillbirths, and had an annual gathering for all of them, with an appropriate ritual of mourning and of celebration of what had come afterwards. And I could the churching of women or the rites of purification, again, maybe not the word I'd use. Could the welcome back be used that way? I think it could, depending on the situation. So moving on, of course, we do celebrate the Annunciation, right? It comes up every year in our lectionary, but it also, there is a feast day for it, March 25th every year. It's a pretty big event. And of course, it's a pretty big event because what's being announced, I mean, it's the angel, it's Gabriel announcing her pregnancy to Mary. But what's really being announced here is Jesus. This is, the New Testament's first historic announcement that Jesus is coming. The Old Testament, if you choose to sometimes called the fifth gospel, but this is a big deal, and we don't make a holiday out of it anymore, and maybe we should. Maybe churches should take a day in March, although of course this falls awfully close to Easter, which a lot of years, which becomes a challenge. By the way, this picture is part of one panel of a very famous triptych by Robert Campen called the Merode Altarpiece. And I held it, I put it up there for you because I wanted you to see a particularly beautiful Annunciation. There's Mary, who's often in these works of art depicted as a nun, which is ridiculous. Here she's reading what's clearly her breviary, which is also kind of ridiculous. Breviaries were invented a good 800 years later. Here's the angel, who's got these particularly bird-like wings. But what I love about it is right up here. Can you see where my cursor is circling? I don't know how it looks on any of your screens. I don't have a way to make this any bigger for you, I'm sorry. But that's the Holy Spirit coming in through the window carrying a cross. And the Holy Spirit there is a little white baby. Actually, that might be Jesus coming in through the window. That might be the Holy Spirit in the wind bringing Jesus and his cross literally physically into Mary. This is from the 15th century. The images may be a little overdone, but on the other hand, it's tiny. You have to squint to see it. By the way, if you ever get a chance to see the original, which is in a museum in New York, it's in the cloisters. The other panel that I didn't reproduce for you, the panel on the right side is Joseph in his workshop. And he's making he's in a wood shop. He looks like he's about 110 years old. And he's making a mousetrap. Because in a famous sermon, St. Augustine once said, the devil thought he'd won when Jesus died on the cross. And that was when the mousetrap snapped shut. The cross of Christ is the devil's mousetrap. And that image was repeated for centuries and is still repeated for centuries when I'm talking because I love it so much. But somebody actually painted it into the story.
Michael, I'm sorry, that was Robert Campen, you said?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure, anytime, Wes. This is a modern painting of the Visitation. Again, it comes up in our lectionary, but I want to remind you that it's got its own feast day, which is in May. Doesn't really interfere with Easter. You could use this in your church. You could have a big celebration. And I particularly love this modern painting by a living painter, because it in a very old-fashioned way. I mean, these guys look like farmers, but here's Mary, here's Elizabeth, here's the embryonic Jesus, and the fetal Jesus and the fetal John, and the fetal John is celebrating. He's jumping in the womb, literally. It's, again, a little overdone, but I just thought it was beautiful. So I wanted to share it with you.
Michael,
Yes.
there's an Annunciation picture that captured me when I was preaching on it in Advent. And it's a painting by Henry Tanner. If you just remember the name Henry Tanner.
Remember it. I'm writing it down.
The painting is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it shows this skinny little teenage girl in kind of rumpled, not real clean bedclothes, in a room that has water stains on the walls, and this pillar of light at the end of her bed. And it's so real. It's like a real teenager. What am I supposed to be doing about this? It's worth it. It's worth it to see it. You will thank me for it. You'll be
I
glad.
will. I'm thinking for it already because I'll look it up before I go home tonight.
Okay.
So one of the big Marian feasts, but again, one that I don't think I've ever been to a Lutheran church service specially devoted to this, unless it happened to fall on a Sunday. Thank you, Elizabeth. Much appreciate the link. Is what we call Mary, Mother of our Lord, on the 15th of August. I was ordained a couple of days before that. I use this as the as a mnemonic to remember when I was ordained. It's the anniversary. Now, here's the funny thing, right? I told you the saints' days are normally the day the person died. In a lot of the early cases, that was usually a bloody martyrdom with all sorts of great stories attached to it. There are stories about the death of the Virgin Mary. They're not bloody martyrdoms, thank heaven. There are kind of more or less kind of two. And here's the thing, neither of them's really old. They both date from between about the 5th and 7th centuries, which sounds old. And I mean, that's really old for, like a piece of cheese, but it's not really old for a church saint story. So the first one, and the one that a lot of people are familiar with, is the idea of the Assumption of the Virgin, right? That she doesn't really die, but is assumed bodily into heaven. In this picture, she's carried by little angels, including my favorites, the little severed head angels down at the bottom. And there are lots and lots of paintings of this. And in some versions of the story, she actually does die. And in some, she doesn't. And there's just a disagreement there. Roman Catholicism has, in modern times, made a dogma out of this, meaning that, in their opinion, you actually have to believe this story to be true in order to be a faithful Catholic. We Lutherans clearly disagree with that. It ain't in the Bible. Why should we believe it? The tradition is late. And in any case, there's another story about it. The dormition, which is a fancy word for falling asleep. It's like a dormitory, right? And according to that tradition, and the story comes in different forms, but basically Mary lives to a ripe old age, moves to Ephesus with St. John, a couple of different places in Ephesus. We'll show you her house if you want, not the same house. A couple of other places, and we'll also show you her house in other cities. Don't make too much of these things. But anyway, as she gets old, she dies a perfectly natural death, except that her son's old buddies, the apostles, gather around her bed to witness it. And some angels are there, visibly or invisibly, and eventually she falls asleep peacefully, and her son, Jesus, receives her soul, which is what's going on in the middle there. Great story. It was at one time actually the feast in the West, in Rome, as well as in the Eastern churches. It eventually got edged out by the Assumption. Sometimes the story is told in a way that tries to bring them together. Here's the thing. Ain't none of it in the Bible. Therefore, we Lutherans have absolutely no reason to take a position on whether she died a natural death or was carried aloft by an army of angels. One of those certainly makes a lot more intuitive sense, and I hope we all know which one it is, but we don't take a position on it. All we do is say 15th of August, she died. So we know she died. The 15th of August is the day the church traditionally says she died. Great. That's it. Perfect. Works for me. What it really is an opportunity to remember. And it's one of several opportunities in the church calendar to remember the Virgin Mary, who really is not a small figure in Christian history and is not a small figure in personal devotion for millions, if not hundreds of millions, if not close up on 1 billion Christians worldwide. Some worth thinking about. There are also some festivals. Let me take a break from sharing for a second. We've got about 20 minutes. I've got plenty more to go here and some saints' days that I think are cool. And I really want to talk about the end of the liturgical year. But it's been all me talking. Does anyone want to jump in with a question or a comment about any of the stuff we've talked about so far? Sanctoral, temporal,
I have one,
Marian. Shoot,
Michael.
Janet, what do you got?
Which one would we go with Mary? You said we as Lutherans would go with one of them. Which one would it be?
Well, okay. I was hoping it was intuitively obvious. Let me ask you this, Janet. Which one sounds likelier to you? Falls asleep naturally,
Yeah.
lifted up by an army of angels.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Falls asleep naturally or army of angels? Which one?
I think falling asleep naturally,
I think so too.
Okay, all right, good.
But here's the thing. In the absence of evidence, that's just because in the absence of evidence, it makes sense to apply Occam's razor, right? Go for the simplest explanation. And there is no real evidence here.
Okay.
The only evidence we've got is she isn't walking around talking now, so we assume she's dead. Right?
Thank you, Michael.
Sure. I was trying to demonstrate there a kind of realistic, no nonsense approach to Saints' Days. I hope you saw that. And nothing I said was meant to indicate any disrespect to those who believe differently.
I have a question. If
Shoot.
About the purification festival and the purification, from what we saw yesterday, and in the Bible, it wasn't just for the first child, and does that go through? And was it only for the first male child?
That's correct.
Okay.
Except there's a different rule for female children, isn't there?
That's right. Yeah. In fact, it's not really specified.
Oh, I thought it was double the time.
I see what you're saying. No.
Deuteronomy.
Oh, no, you're right about that. I misunderstood the question. You're right about that. Yeah, it's twice the amount of time for the purification of the family following, or the mother following the birth of a female child rather than a male child. So there was the male child has the double thing of being dedicated to the Lord. And so there was some of you may remember a time when in Roman Catholic families, the firstborn son would always be expected to become a priest. It's that kind of expectation in ancient Israel where the firstborn son belonged to the Lord for whatever it is that Israel wanted that child to do. And that was the redemptive activity that would.
But Stephanie, I want to be real clear about one thing here. When I'm suggesting trying to find a modern day pastoral adaptation of this for use in congregational life, I'm definitely not suggesting that we attempt to import wholesale Old Testament or even early medieval or high medieval customs, a lot of which are loaded with theological ideas that really don't work for us. I mean, do you get what okay, thanks. Because that's important. I'm not
Thank you.
I'm not saying we should all turn ourselves into, into ancient Jews. That really, honestly, and again, that sounds lighthearted, but I served a congregation once where there had been in a neighboring congregation an actual cult that emerged out of a couple of pastors literally telling their congregation that was exactly what they should do. It got really scary and crazy. It was the 70s at its worst. And I can't even tell you how bad it was, even 30, 40 years later. So I'm emphatically not trying to go that direction.
For David and Michael, my understanding of part of the purification is also similar to sacrifice. And it's this notion that all life is a gift from God, not ours. We don't control life, even birth of children or favorite animals or anything. Those were rights which reminded the people of Israel that they didn't own their children. They were a gift from God to them, the purification and the sacrificial thing. Am I right on that, or am I off base on that? You two?
Sounds right to me.
Yeah, no, there's definitely that dimension to it. That's an important dimension to it. For what it's worth, I mean, I'll spend a few minutes on this on Thursday evening, kind of sort of coming at the whole concept of what purification was, right? And it'll dovetail nicely with some of the things that Michael
Yeah.
said.
Will it turtle dovetail?
Yeah, maybe. about the ritual having a function of reintroducing someone into the community. I think that's really key.
But I also need to say, I mean, I really need to jump in and say, once the S word comes up, sacrifice, I've got to just remind you all that, anthropologically, sacrifice is basically common to virtually all known religious practice. It is, essential to the religious practice described by the Old Testament, even when that practice is sometimes moralized or allegorized, the sacrifice pleasing to God is a broken heart. But Christianity, and particularly Protestant Christianity, have dramatically reinterpreted so that when we talk about sacrifice, the only sacrifice worthy of the name, and therefore the only one of any value, is the cross, exactly. So that even though Mary and Joseph followed the law and made a sacrifice, that doesn't mean that, that there's any Christian reason to start murdering turtle doves, right? Or do anything like that. That would be antithetical to our faith. I know it's obvious, but I sometimes just feel like I need to make the point. Oh, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I had never heard the turtle dove thing, or I glossed over it. So I guess that's the turtle doves in the song, right? So my silly question is, are there any other animals in that 12 Days of Christmas that are in the Bible? And my slightly less silly question is, did they eat the turtle doves? Because I've heard some rationalizing of this by, oh yeah, they ate all those animals that they sacrificed.
Okay. So let me handle the 12 Days of Christmas. I love that song. And you will see on the internet floating around a very complex explanation, a sort of a meme now, about how this was secretly a catechetical tool used by recusant Catholics in Protestant England to teach the faith to their children. It's completely false. Everything about that meme is false. So and that's more or less proven. The guy who came up with it just lied and then claimed that all his evidence had been wiped out in a flood. That's an old folk song, typical of its age. There's really not much biblical to it. Turtle doves are just a kind of bird. They happen to have been used for sacrifices, but golden rings, lords a leaping, it's really not biblical. There are songs that do try to take biblical imagery and use them that way. This isn't one of them. As to what happened to biblical sacrifices, I'm a little over my head on that one. Dave, do you have any insider knowledge?
Sure, I'll be glad to address that just a little bit if you want me to. I think the best place to start in terms of thinking about that is to think about the idea of sacrifice in the Old Testament as primarily with respect to the meal. In other words, you have to start in the Exodus images of God dining with Israel. There's images of them eating and drinking together. And so every time you have a temple experience where there is food brought, it is an attempt to try and re-experience that encounter with God. It was also the way in which the priests ate. So whenever animals were brought, yes, they were cooked and eaten for the most part. Only very few sacrificial ceremonies in the temple were what they called whole burnt offerings. In other words, the entire animal would be burnt. That was rare, actually, in terms of the way, and proportionately rare in terms of the way sacrificial ones. It was really an opportunity to have a meal together in the presence, eating and drinking in the presence of God, which then became part of the imagery when we started thinking about our Holy Communion, right? So what are we doing at the Festival of the Eucharist except eating and drinking in the presence of God? So there's that correlation from Old and New Testament. But there's another dimension to it that helps. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself for Thursday, but I'll be glad to repeat all of that. The redemptive quality is that the sacrifice is a substitution for yourself. In other words, if you were to bring a lamb, a spotless lamb, this was like your life savings. In other words, you're saying, this is really me. I should be the one in this place, sacrificing my whole life to God. Instead, I'm bringing this animal. And when the firstborn son was brought to the temple, the redemptive work was you would bring the animals to substitute for the firstborn son to be dedicated to the thing. There was never any thought that you would eat the firstborn son, but you have this meal that's provided by you as a way of redeeming the son.
Okay, Dave is killing me here because what he says leads into one of my very favorite subjects that I can't talk about tonight because of time, which is the Apology for the Augsburg Confession, Article 24.
Yes.
Melanchthon on the Eucharistic sacrifice. And I'm dying here, people, because next year at Power in the Spirit, okay? Let me move on because there's a couple of other observances I'd like to share with you if I can.
No. You can't drop it like that. You got to say one sentence about
Okay.
Article 24.
So what the Lutheran confessions actually say is that I was wrong when I gave you that arch Protestant statement about sacrifice, right? I said the only sacrifice that matters theologically is the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, to which Melanchthon responds, kind of. In fact, the community's self-sacrifice, its offering of thanksgiving and praise also matters theologically. And that is what we bring when we worship together. That's what we bring to the table. Does it redeem us? No. Does it propitiate the wrath of God? No. Is it nonetheless a sacrifice in some sense? Yes. So we actually have a more nuanced language for sacrifice in our church.
That is interesting, though, because that
the
goes into
Lutherans
the whole
realize.
offertory processional thing.
Guys, this is going to be pastors talking to pastors if I don't move on. I'm sorry.
I hope that all those still pictures are not blank stares, but rather frozen cameras.
I really am sorry. I love the subject we're leading into, but it starts to get, it's like it's its own subject. So we talked about Mary. Mentioned, okay. A couple of other things I want to talk about. Forget the name of Jesus for now. I can't believe I just said that. And now I have to take it back. So on January 1st, I don't know about you, I almost never want to lead a worship service on January 1st. And almost nobody in my congregation wants to come to one because we've just had Christmas and we're all wiped out, right? Nonetheless, the church calendar gives us one. It was actually originally a Marian feast because, like I said, a lot of stuff used to be about Mary. But of course, biblically, the 8th day, the octave of Christmas, the 8th day after after his birth, was the day he was circumcised. But we moderns get a little antsy talking about circumcision too much. So we tend to call it the name of Jesus, which in fact was also given to him at his circumcision. And it's a pretty big deal. As Dave said last night, it means, he saves, Yeshua. The fact that that's his name is a big deal theologically. Here's one that's interesting a little later in the month, and that we really could do more with pastorally. And by pastorally here, I just mean congregationally. All of your churches could be doing more with this. The Confession of St. Peter on January 18th. Jesus says, well, who do people say that I am? You're Elijah, you're the prophet. Who do you say that I am? And Peter, speaking for the 12, says, I say that you're the Christ. Right? Huge moment in the three synoptic gospels. In Mark's gospel, it falls right at the midpoint. Mark is probably the first one to be written. It falls almost exactly in the middle. It is the hinge, I believe, on which the whole gospel turns, is Peter finally recognizing who Jesus is. And then Jesus is free to turn himself toward Jerusalem and the cross. In this famous painting from the Renaissance, Jesus is handing Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, right? By itself, it's an enormous moment. It cut out. Hang on a second. I really prefer to view it in focus because I think you can see better. But it means I'm going to have to skim all the way through it again. But then there's another one a week later, January 25th, the conversion of St. Paul from Acts, of course. In the Confession of Peter, Jesus says, who do you say that I am? In the conversion of Paul, Paul, sees a blinding light. He loses his vision. He says, he hears a voice saying, why are you persecuting me? He says, who are you, Lord? So first, Jesus asks the question of Peter. Now, Paul asks the question of Jesus. Who are you? Because he's an unbeliever. He doesn't know. He needs to have it introduced to him. A great story. You've all heard it a million times, probably accompanied by singing Amazing Grace. I once was blind, but now I see. The fact that these two events fall a week away from each other in the calendar is certainly not accidental, nor is the related fact that their martyrdom falls on the same day, June 29th. So from reading Acts that there's a pretty clear record that Paul got himself in some trouble with the conservative Christian leaders in Jerusalem. He was spreading the message to Gentiles, to those who weren't circumcised and didn't keep kosher and didn't follow the other ceremonial laws of Judaism. And James, particularly, and some others said that they really should, that to be part of the Jesus movement meant to be a Jew. First, you had to be part of Judaism, to be part of this little subset of Judaism. And Peter was one of those leaders, at least for a while. Acts gives a description of him sort of changing after a revelation from Jesus. It's a little less clear when you read Paul's letters on the subject. But the point is, there's a history of these two extremely famous and extremely influential Christian leaders disagreeing. And then there's a history of them being reconciled, right? The reconciliation is, the reconciliation comes when they connect in Rome. They're both missionaries in Rome, and they're both executed different ways, but at the same time. It's a very, very famous image of coming together, of opposites or of opponents being reconciled. It's also significant because we Lutherans and Protestants in general lean toward an extremely Pauline description of how salvation works, justification by grace through faith for the sake of Christ. Roman Catholicism leans very heavily on St. Peter being given the keys to the kingdom of heaven and his role as the first bishop of Rome, and claims him as a sort of a spiritual forebear. And so from the mid 20th century, there has been what we call the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, which is celebrated it's the week between the confession of Peter and the conversion of Paul. And it originated at this little place here, which is a monastery in New York State. I've been there any number of times. It's called Graymoor. The group there is called the Franciscan Friars of the Atonement. Today, they are a Roman Catholic movement, but they were originally actually non-denominational and composed about half of Episcopalians and half of Roman Catholics. They came up with the idea of the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. That is a week for ecumenical conversation. In a lot of countries and places, ecumenical worship. I've taken part in these, but I have to tell you, I've never taken part in one in a Lutheran church. I've taken part in them in Greek Catholic churches, Roman Catholic churches, what have you. We're closing fast, but I would like to suggest that this has some real pastoral possibilities. And let me skip some other stuff. I want to talk to you about Mary Magdalene, St. Michael, the Holy Cross. Oh, the presentation of the Augsburg Confession. It's so important. It's the real Reformation Day, June 25th. Forget the posting of the 95 Theses. Who cares? Nobody can read them. They're gibberish. People, the Augsburg Confession is what determines our faith as Lutherans. It's their basic doctrine. It was presented by lay people. It's an example of lay leadership in the church and how important it is. This should be Reformation Day, June 25th. I've got Scandinavian Heroes, Lutherans in America, Santa Lucia, and the End of Time. But we don't have time for it. I am sorry, everybody.
Hey,
We're-
Michael, would
Get
it
Root's
be
about to end.
possible for you to share this PowerPoint?
Sure, no problem.
We can include that in upcoming emails and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I want to know more about all these.
It's not even a PowerPoint. It's a Word document. I'll
Word
happily
doc.
send it.
Even
I'll
better.
happily send it to you all.
Thank you, sir.
Let me stop sharing, which
You
I
should
can
do another workshop, Michael, in July. Continuation.
I just do the end, the last couple of festivals. Listen, last couple of seconds. Any questions? Anything anybody wants to know?
I do, but it's really bizarre. And that
Sure.
is that I remember reading maybe incorrectly that James was always mentioned first, okay, as the head of the church in Jerusalem.
Yeah,
And I
that's
could be
correct.
wrong on that. But
No.
is there anything you could point me to read about how he disappeared and how Peter and Paul became so much more important than he?
So I can, because I did not find, I didn't ever see one this morning. So I maybe need to look